Sometimes, in hip-hop, it's not what you say. It's what you barely say that changes everything. Tony Yayo didn't drop a diss. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call out names with anger. But when he casually mentioned one name, Nas, the entire hip-hop world felt it. Because history doesn't forget. And neither do fans. For years, Nas has stood as one of the most respected lyricists ever. Tony Yayo, forever linked to G-Unit, represents a different era, a different energy, a different side of hip-hop politics. So when those two worlds quietly touched, even for a moment, people leaned in. Was it respect? Was it tension? Or was it something deeper that never fully disappeared? Social media caught it instantly. Clips started circulating. Comments turned into debates. Debates turned into theories. Some fans said, it's nothing. Others said, nah, you don't just say Nas' name like that for no reason. And that's the thing about hip-hop. Silence can be louder than a diss track. Because behind that one mention lies decades of history. Alliances, rivalries, and unspoken rules. And once you understand who said it, when they said it, and why, it mattered. You realize this wasn't random at all. This wasn't about clout. This wasn't about nostalgia. This was about timing. This was about context. And this was about how one quiet moment reminded everyone that in hip-hop, nothing ever really stays buried. Hip-hop has never been just about music. It's about moments. And sometimes, the smallest moments carry the biggest weight. Tony Yayo didn't walk into that conversation trying to start anything. No shouting, no bold claims, no headlines planned, but hip-hop doesn't always warn you before it shifts. Because when Tony Yayo casually mentioned Nas, something subtle happened. The energy changed. Not on camera alone, but across the culture to understand why you have. To understand who Tony Yayo is and what he represents. Tony Yayo isn't just a rapper. His history is attached to a name, G-Unit, 50 Cent. An era where loyalty was currency, beef was public, and words had consequences. Yayo comes from a time when alliances mattered more than algorithms. When mentions weren't accidental. And when saying someone's name carried weight far beyond the sentence itself. So when he said Nas, even calmly, hip-hop heard it differently. Because Nas isn't just another artist. Nas is a symbol. He represents lyrical dominance, New York royalty, survival through eras where others faded, and respect that doesn't need to be shouted. Nas doesn't chase moments. Moments chase him. That's why fans didn't brush this off. That's why comment sections exploded. That's why people replayed the clip again and again. Because in hip-hop, nothing is ever truly random. People started asking questions almost immediately. Why now? Why Nas? Why say his name so casually yet so precisely? Some said it was just conversation. Others weren't convinced. Because Tony Yayo has been in too many rooms, seen too many politics, lived too many stories to casually misstep like that. And then there's timing. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Nas has been quietly active. Projects, legacy talk. The ongoing debate about who really sits at the top of hip-hop history at the same time. Old voices from the 2000s era have been resurfacing. Podcasts, interviews, reflections. When history speaks again, people listen. That's why this moment hit differently, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive. Didn't need to be. It felt deliberate. And hip-hop fans are trained to read between the lines. They notice the pause, the tone, the way the name landed. Tony Yayo didn't add an explanation. He didn't follow it with praise or criticism. And that silence, it's what made it loud. Because in hip-hop, silence can mean respect, or tension, or unfinished business sometimes. All 3DAT people started digging into the past, as they always do. Old interviews, old moments. Old affiliations. Goonet versus the rest of New York. Nas standing alone while the industry shifted around him. Different lanes. No Public war between Yayo and Nas, but also no clear bond, which is exactly where mystery lives. And mystery is fuel for drama. Fans split into camps almost instantly. One side said, "This is nothing. Y'all overthinking." The other side said, "Nah, you don't mention Nas unless it means something." And both sides had a point, because Tony Yayo knows how hip-hop works. He knows how fans think. He knows how fast narratives spread, which leads to the real question: was this moment accidental or calculated? Not in a malicious way, but in a cultural way. A reminder, a signal, a subtle acknowledgement that history is still watching. Because Nas exists in a space where mentioning him automatically triggers debate. Greatest of all time, New York's crown. Longevity versus impact. Every conversation about Nas carries weight, and Tony Yayo knows that, which is why people didn't let this go. Because the hip-hop audience has matured. They don't just listen, they analyze. They understand context. They understand subtext. And they understand that sometimes the real story isn't in the headline. It's in the pause right before the words. This wasn't a diss. But it wasn't empty either. It felt like someone opening a door. Just slightly and letting people peek inside. And once that door opens, curiosity takes over. Because hip-hop is built on stories that were never fully told, and this felt like one of them. By the end of that clip, Tony Yayo moved on. The conversation continued, but the audience didn't, because something had already been set in motion. A reminder that even decades later, names still matter. Reputations still echo. And one sentence can revive 1,000 conversations. And this was only the beginning, because to truly understand why mentioning Nas mattered, you have to go back to the eras, back to politics, back to the moments that shaped both men. And once you see that history clearly, you'll realize this wasn't just a name drop. It was a signal to understand why Tony Yayo mentioning Nas felt heavier than it sounded. You have to rewind way back to New York when hip-hop wasn't just music. K was territory. Nas came into the game carrying something rare, raw storytelling mixed with street poetry. From the moment Illmatic dropped, the rules shifted. Not because Nas was loud, but because he was undeniable. He didn't chase trends. He became a reference point. Nas represented the soul of New York. Gritty, reflective, unapologetically real. While the industry leaned toward flash, Nas leaned toward truth. And that mattered. Because years later, different energy took over New York. Enter G-Unit. 50 Cent. Tony Yayo, Lloyd Banks. This wasn't poetic rap. This was survival rap. Aggressive. Loud, strategic. G-Unit. Didn't just dominate charts. They dominated space. Radio, streets, industry politics. Tony Yayo stood right in the middle of that storm. Not as the loudest voice, but as the loyal soldier. The presence. The enforcer. Yayo wasn't chasing lyrical crowns. He was holding the line. And here's where things get interesting. Nas and G-Unit were never open enemies. But they were never aligned either. They represented two different philosophies of hip-hop. Nas believed legacy came from artistry. G-Unit believed legacy came from impact and dominance. Both are valid. Both are powerful, but very different. And in hip-hop, differences don't need diss tracks to create tension. Sometimes they just exist. As G-Unit rose, Nas stayed. Nas, no group, no movement. Just bars and perspective. And that independence made him dangerous and respected, because Nas didn't need approval. And the industry knows that's rare. Fast forward. Through the years, G-Unit faded from the spotlight. Not disappeared, but transformed into legacy acts, podcasts, reflections. Nas. He evolved late career runs, critical acclaim, a resurgence that shocked people who thought his era was over. And that's key. Because hip-hop rarely lets legends age gracefully. But Nas did. Which brings us back to Tony Yayo. When Yayo speaks today, he speaks from experience, from history, from a position where nothing needs to be proven. So when he mentions Nas now, it hits differently than it would have 20 years ago. Because time adds meaning. Back in the day, saying Nas' name would have been read as competition. Today, it's read as acknowledgement. Or reflection. And reflection can be uncomfortable because it forces comparison, and comparison raises questions. Who really lasted? Who really shaped culture? Who stood the test of time? These are questions hip-hop fans never stop asking, which is why that single mention stirred everything up. Tony Yayo didn't say Nas is the greatest. He didn't say Nas fell off. He didn't say anything definitive. And that's what made it powerful, because by not defining it, he let the audience define it themselves. And the audience did exactly that. Some fans saw respect. Others saw distance. Some saw unresolved tension. Others saw maturity. But everyone saw meaning, because Tony Yayo comes from a camp where silence used to mean strategy, where words were chosen carefully or not at all. And Nas comes from a camp where every word is dissected. So when those worlds briefly intersect, people pay attention. People pay attention. Another layer made this moment even heavier. Nas has often stood outside cliques. He wasn't Junet. He wasn't Dipset. He wasn't chasing movements. He was singular. That made him untouchable in some ways and isolated in others. Meanwhile, G-Unit was the definition of unity. Strength in numbers, visibility everywhere. And Tony Yayo was part of that machine. Which means when Yayo mentions Nas, it almost feels like history tipping its hat. Not officially, not loudly, but subtly, and subtlety is rare in hip-hop. Especially today, where everything is exaggerated. Everything is viral. Everything is instant. This moment wasn't. It felt old-school, measured, controlled, intentional. And that's why older fans felt it deeper, because they remember when New York rap wasn't about algorithms, was about presence. Nas always had a presence, which leads to another uncomfortable truth. Nas outlived most narratives. He survived trends that buried legends. He avoided scandals that destroyed careers. He adapted without losing identity. And that longevity changes how people talk about you, especially people from rival eras. Tony Yayo knows this, and whether consciously or not, that knowledge came through in that mention. It wasn't casual. I was careful. And careful words usually come from experience. The internet, of course, did what it does best. They clipped the moment, looped it, slow it down. People analyzed facial expressions. Tone shifts. Timing. Was Yayo relaxed? Was he guarded? Was he nostalgic? Different answers, same conclusion. This moment mattered because hip-hop is built on layers, and this moment had many. Layer 1. It's two names from different eras. Layer 2. New York history. Layer 3. Legacy versus dominance. Layer 4. Silence versus statements. And once you stack those layers, you realize something important? This wasn't about beef, it was about memory, about what lasts when the noise fades. And that's why this moment stuck, because it reminded fans that hip-hop isn't just about who was loudest, it's about who's still being talked about when the room gets quiet. And Nas is always talked about, even when he's not in the room. Which brings us to the real turning point. Tony Yayo didn't just mention Nas. He reminded everyone that Nas never left the conversation. And that realization unsettled people more than any diss could. Because it forces you to rethink timelines, rankings, legacies. And once those questions are asked, they don't go away. They linger. And that's exactly where we are now. We're going to break down what this moment really means for hip-hop today. Why fans reacted the way they did. And why this quiet moment says more about the culture than 100 loud beefs ever could by the time the clips stopped circulating. One thing was clear, this wasn't about Tony Yayo, and it wasn't just about NAS. It was about what hip-hop chooses to remember. Because if this moment had happened 10 years ago, it might have been ignored. If it had happened 20 years ago, it might have turned into beef. But today, it became a conversation. And that says everything about where hip-hop is now. We're living in an era where noise is constant. Everyone is talking. Everyone is reacting. Everyone is chasing attention. So when a moment arrives that's quiet, controlled, almost restrained, it stands out immediately. Tony Yayo didn't demand attention. He didn't provoke outrage. He didn't chase headlines. Yet headlines followed anyway. Why? Because modern hip-hop is starving for meaning. Not volume. Nas represents meaning. He represents survival in a culture that rarely lets artists stage with dignity. He represents patience in a world addicted to instant reactions. He represents substance in an era of surface-level moments. That's why his name still carries weight. And that's why Tony Yayo mentioning him, even briefly, felt like a signal flare. Not loud, but visible. The internet reacted the way it always does. Emotionally at first, analytically later. You saw the comments. Some people laughed it off. Some people reached back into history. Some people turned it into rankings. Others turned it into narratives. But beneath all of that was one shared instinct. People wanted this moment to mean something, because hip-hop fans don't just consume culture, they protect it. And when a moment feels like it connects past and present, they hold on to it. This wasn't nostalgia. It was a reflection, Tony. Yayo represents an era where hip-hop was about power, numbers, visibility. Momentum. Not NAs represents an era and a mindset where hip-hop was about impact, longevity, craft. Truth, neither is wrong, but only one survives. Time unchanged. And time has been very kind to Nas. That's the uncomfortable truth many fans were forced to confront, because when you strip away chart positions and radio dominance, what remains? Lyrics, stories, influence. And Nas has all three. This is where the conversation quietly shifted. It stopped being about Tony Yayo's intent and started being about hip-hop's priorities. What do we value more, moments or meaning? Because Tony Yayo's career is deeply respected. No one denies his place in history. But Nas occupies a different category. He's not just remembered. He's referenced. Every new lyricist is compared to him. Every greatest list circles back to him. Every New York conversation eventually leads to him. End. When someone from a rival era mentions his name without dismissal, it feels like acknowledgement, even if unspoken. Not surrender. Not praise. Recognition. End. Recognition carries weight, especially when it comes from someone who has nothing to gain from giving it. Tony Yayo doesn't need Nas for relevance. Nas doesn't need Tony Yayo for validation. That's what made the moment real. No cloud exchange. No marketing angle, just two legacies briefly intersecting. And in that intersection, fans saw clarity. The younger generation reacted differently. They didn't see old politics. They didn't feel old tensions. They saw two names they'd heard about and wondered why one still felt current. Why Nas still sounded relevant. Why his bars still aged well. Why his presence still mattered. That curiosity is powerful, because it proves that legacy isn't about staying visible. It's about staying necessary. Nas stayed necessary. And moments like this remind people. Why? This is why there was no disresponse, no clarification, no follow-up drama, because nothing needed to be said. The culture spoke for itself. The debates, the breakdowns, the long threads, all proving the same point. Hip-hop doesn't forget who shaped it. It just waits for the right moment to remember. And this was one of those moments. Tony Yayo moved on. The clip faded. But the discussion, DIDN, single quotes, because discussions rooted in legacy don't disappear. They evolve. They resurface every time someone asks, who really mattered? And that's where this story lands. Not in conflict, but in contrast. Two paths, two eras. Two definitions of success. One built on domination, the other built on endurance. And endurance always wins in the end. That's not a diss. That's history. So when people say, Tony Yayo didn't say much, they're right. But when they add, mentioning Nas changed everything, they're not exaggerating because it reminded everyone that in hip-hop, legacy isn't decided by who speaks the loudest. It's decided by who's still being spoken about when everyone else goes quiet. And Nas. Nas is always part of the conversation, even when no one is talking. If you felt something while watching this, you're not alone. Because moments like this aren't just about Tony Yayo or Nas. They're about how you see hip-hop. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think Tony Yayo mentioning Nas was just a casual moment? Or do you believe there was history, respect, or unfinished energy behind it? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't hold back, cause hip-hop lives in conversation, not silence. If you believe Nas represents true longevity and lyricism, say it. If you think G-Unit's era shaped the culture in a way that can't be ignored, say that too. There's no wrong answer here, only perspective. But here's the real question. Who defines legacy in hip-hop today? Is it numbers? Is it influence? Or is it staying relevant when the noise fades? If this breakdown made you think deeper than just headlines, hit that like button. It tells us you want more stories like this. And if you're tired of surface level drama and want real context, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we don't chase rumors, we break down moments that actually matter. Share this video with someone who understands hip-hop beyond trends. Someone who knows the culture doesn't forget, it remembers. And stay locked in because the next story, it might sound small at first, but like this one, it could change everything. Change everything.